In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
To say of a politician that he or she has a big personality is rather different from saying that they have a big nose or waistline. Noses and waistlines can be measured with rulers and tape measures. Personalities are symbolic assets. My favourite big personality politician might be your most loathed garrulous show-off. So what do we actually mean when we say that a politician is a big personality? Well, I think we're getting at three things. First of all, that they're recognisable, usually by the sound of their voice or some particular look or mannerism that marks them out from the common herd of would-be leaders. Secondly, that they're admired for who they are as much as, if not more, than for what they stand for. There is something about their personal demeanour that is attractive, perhaps even seductive, to a group of people. And thirdly, that they're both predictable and unpredictable. The former, because their actions seem to be consistent with their character. The latter, when their character runs against the grain of conventional performance and surprises, even shocks us. Big political personalities are not unlike celebrities. It is much easier to gather a fan base for a person with their own distinctive face and voice than for an abstract policy document. Big personality politicians can move swiftly from rallies of the faithful to stunts in the street to TV game shows without needing to change gear. All that they need to do is keep their personality on display, showing the world that whatever else might be happening, Winston will still be smoking his cigar and pontificating in his familiar deep tones. Donald will still be wearing his baseball hat and rehearsing the same old grievances. Tony Benn, that is, will be drawing on his pipe and offering an analysis so familiar that his followers could say it along with him. And then there was the man they called Boris, possibly the most effective big personality politician in recent years, even though his real name was actually Alexander, not Boris. And his personality came with a longer list of risk factors than the Sizewell reactor. Here he is, telling people on the street of the wonders to come if only they would vote for Brexit.
Friends, now this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance for us to take back control of this country. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah! Because the organisation that we belong to now, the European Union, has changed out of all recognition from what we signed up to in 1972. And if we vote leave on June the 23rd, we can take back control of £350 million a week and spend on our priorities here in this country, including on the National Health Service. We can take back control of our immigration system in bunches of more than 2 or 3 bananas. You cannot sell bananas with abnormal curvature of the fingers. Why should they tell us? Why should they tell us how powerful our vacuum cleaners should be? Why should they tell us how powerful our hairdryers should be? This is not a matter for an international, supranational body to dictate to the British people.
Notice how he greets these strangers as friends. And by the time that he's finished with them, they really did believe that they were his friends. And here he is addressing his party conference.
When I stood on the steps of Downing Street, I promised to fix this crisis. And after decades of drift and dither, this reforming government, this can-do government, This government that got Brexit done, that's getting the COVID vaccine rollout done, is going to get social care done. And we are going to deal with the biggest underlying issues of our economy and society, the problems that no government has had the guts to tackle before. And I mean the long-term structural weaknesses in the UK economy.
Many interesting works of discourse analysis have been conducted, deconstructing in great detail the ways in which Johnson used the performed political language that was so associated with him. But I think that these can be boiled down to three main features. Firstly, here was a politician with a voice that moves, that carries listeners along on the ways of its sound as well as the imagery of its content. It's anything but the flat recitation of the politician reading a prepared script. It is a voice that, like a great actor's, is capable of taking people on a journey. Secondly, there appears to be little difference between what he is and what he's saying. The saying is a sort of public undressing, an exposure of a core self. The personality is not only the communication vehicle, but the essence of what is being conveyed. And thirdly, this politician feels confident that he is addressing people who like him, what is often these days referred to as his base. And here lies a clue to the risks associated with personality politicians. Gods and heroes before their base. What happens when they have to address an audience that wants rather more than a well-rehearsed performance of voracious ego? Well, let's see what does happen.
So with safer streets, with great local schools, with fantastic broadband, forgive me. Forgive me. Forgive me. Yesterday I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World. I don't know if you've been to Peppa Pig World. Who's been to? Hands up anybody who's been to Peppa Pig World. Not enough. I was a bit hazy what I would find at Peppa Pig World, but I loved it. And Peppa Pig World is very much my kind of place. It has very safe streets, discipline in schools, heavy emphasis on new mass transit systems, I notice, even if they're a bit stereotypical about Daddy Pig.
This was the speech when Johnson lost his way in the script and was forced to rely upon nothing but a spontaneously improvised display of personality. The speech turned into an embarrassing impersonation of himself by a speaker who turned out to sound rather less than the sum of his own image. A few audience members tittered at the performance. Oh, listen to this, it's Boris being Boris. But most of them sat in awkward silence. Having a big personality is one thing, but only having a big personality. Faced with the challenges bigger than his own capacity to bluster, that charismatic je ne sais quoi imploded into something that sounded, well, rather pathetic, actually. And the more he had to explain himself to people who weren't subscribers to the fan club, the worse it got for him.
But let me begin in all humility by saying that on the 12th of April, I received a fixed penalty notice relating to an event in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020. I paid the fine immediately, and I offered the British people a full apology. And I take this opportunity on the first available sitting day to repeat my wholehearted apology to the House. As soon as I received the notice I acknowledge the hurt and the anger.
This is where a rather different kind of politician might have more effectively stepped in, rather less loud or showy or performative, but good at managing situations where they are not worshipped before they even enter the room. Because political communication in a democracy, I would argue, is not the art of offering well-anticipated refrains to a base or a fan club, but appealing with persuasive force to people who remain to be convinced. Boris Johnson came onto the political scene as the biggest of personalities, and now he seems to have disappeared from it. Who knows if he'll attempt to return? Of one thing we can be quite sure: there will be others auditioning for the role. But does the performance of that role make the political play better or worse? Well, who better to answer that question than the former BBC political journalist and current political strategist, Guto Harri, who was at university with Boris Johnson and later went on to work as his director of communications, both when he was mayor of London and in Downing Street during that Partygate scandal. Hi, really nice to be able to speak to you. So let me get then to the first question. I expect that if I asked a number of people in the street to name a political personality, a big political personality, then many, if not most of them, would say, Boris Johnson, he was a big political personality. What do you think they mean by that? What, in your view, makes for a striking political personality?
Well, I think in politics, as in every other walk of life, really, but maybe more so, people are looking for characters who stand out from the crowd. Somebody who's painted in, neon lights rather than in shades of grey. Somebody who is memorable. Somebody whose turn of phrase is less corporate, less predictable, less dull than most people. People are prepared to show a bit more of themselves in public rather than fall into some sort of ghastly sort of role play of what they think a certain kind of person in a certain kind of role should be like. And above all, we're all very, very vulnerable, understandably, to people who are funny, people who make us laugh. And that is one of the great joys of people who are standout, if you like, particularly in politics. And it's certainly something that at this heyday made Boris Johnson stand out.
You've certainly described very clearly what a political personality is. Now, a slightly different version of that question: are political personalities, the big, extravagant political personalities, good for democratic politics? Do they, in adding all of the colour and excitement, also pose certain kinds of risks? And if they do, what are those risks?
Well, politics for me, and I think this is timeless and universal, is essentially about the exercise of power in accordance with a certain set of principles. And in a democracy, a prerequisite of being in a position to exercise power according to the principles that matter to you and the priorities that matter to you is that you can persuade people to give you a chance over somebody else. So it boils down to the art of persuasion. And people with character and personality and, dare I say, charm are more likely to persuade us of things than people who don't have that, which doesn't mean that we fall foolishly for people who are, kind of saying the opposite of what they believe, or people who are inauthentic, or people who are literally patronizing us and treating us like morons. But I think if you think about it, it doesn't matter if you have a personality or not to be a fantastic accountant. It does matter if the very thing that you're engaged in is the art of persuasion. And if you turn that argument on its head, do we really want somebody with no connection with the British public when the core of our democracy means that they have to persuade the public, in this case, every 4 years or so, voters, to give them a chance? And that's core to our democracy. So, of course, there are dangers if we are blinded by character or personality and we don't actually look at the policies, we don't look at the essence of the person and what they're likely to do in power. But I think we're usually a long way from that. And dare I say, there's a lot of very dull, grey, boring people out there who try to say that having character and personality is a negative because they don't have it.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. Is that what you think is in fact going on in politics? That politics tends to attract the kind of people who, dare I say, perhaps nobody wanted to sit next to at the desk when they were at school, weren't chosen for the football team, weren't the most charming of people. Somebody comes along who's a big personality and they think, well, this sort of person shouldn't really be in our gang. Why are they here? You think there's something like that going on?
Well, I think in the end, politics is a brutal game, and I think it's harder than ever. And if you imagine two of the biggest characters, but also two of the objectively most successful prime ministers we've ever had. I put Lloyd George first and Churchill second, but I'm happy for people to switch them. But we're talking about people who won wars. We're talking about Lloyd George, who laid the foundations of the welfare state. We're talking about people who captured the imagination of the vast majority of the public and took them on a journey that was difficult at the time for many, many reasons. You imagine those two characters with all the famous flaws that they had. Lloyd George, a notorious womanizer, sold peerages to the House of Lords, had a mistress living in number 10, working for him, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Imagine them in a world of 24/7 press and media and social media, and more importantly, inquiries from the Met Police, Sue Gray, Harriet Harman, standards committees, Lord Geitz, you name whatever sort of modern construct you want. And they would not last long enough to have achieved the great things that they did. And so we are in danger of creating a world where we get the politicians that we don't want, that we get the boring accountant who happens to make it to the top because we think we don't need a connection. We do.
So turning that on its head, does that mean that a Clement Attlee, arguably another great prime minister, but hardly a charismatic figure, couldn't or shouldn't be the kind of person who would make it in contemporary politics?
Well, Clement Attlee did lead a sort of team. So he went for a different model. And it's like the most brilliant outside half in rugby who doesn't necessarily score the tries himself, but without him or her on the field, nobody else does. Yeah. So you could almost say that Clement Attlee was a fantastic game player with an extraordinary array of talent around him. What he did, almost his sort of personal weakness, was a great strength in office, was allow all the other characters to shine, and he was able to still hold that team together. So he had, a certain sort of grit to him, and he had a certain integrity to him. Yeah. But it is quite telling, despite all the achievements of those 5 hyperactive years after the Second World War, that he was not re-elected. And maybe that gives you a clue as to the weakness of not having a bit more oomph than Attlee had, however great his other strengths were.
I wonder whether you're going to want to answer this question. Were there occasions when you needed to advise Boris Johnson to curb his personality, shall we say? Perhaps, for example, to hold back on a funny comment or a performative antic? Presumably, as a communication advisor, that could have been one of your roles. I wonder, A, did you do it? And B, if you did it, whether he minded you doing it?
Well, there were times when, I've advised him and others to be themselves, only just a little bit less so. But this idea that somehow Boris needed this kind of like handbrake on him at all times and a massive filter between him and the public misses the point about A, the importance of charm, but B, also the seriousness of the man. Because, if you look at the speeches that Boris made, trying to persuade reluctant European colleagues and a reluctant America, for instance, to back President Zelensky and oppose the attempted Russian invasion of Ukraine, you will struggle to find a more intelligent, compelling, articulate case made by anyone, I would say. And he could apply that to many other things as well. So this is not a case of having some sort of moron who has to be protected from himself. And I think the problem in communications quite often is you have a whole ton of very mediocre people who don't know how to be articulate and persuasive and compelling. And they think their very role is to say, no comment, let's hide, let's not engage with anyone, because if we don't engage, we can't be blamed for messing up. No, but neither can you actually achieve anything. And a lack of communication and a lack of charm and a lack of resonance is a default position too, which has a downside. And for all the talk of, super competent, teetotal, immaculately dressed Rishi Sunak, he was the guy who launched the general election campaign dripping wet in sodding rain. And he was the man whose innermost team prepared to be very critical of others, who missed the fact that prime ministers don't generally or shouldn't generally avoid being present at D-Day celebrations, big D-Day celebrations when every other relevant world leader is there. So, there's a lot of people out there who think that the art of communication and at the core of politics is the avoidance of any potential risk or embarrassment. Well, if you play it safe like that, you never make the connection that gets you the kind of record electoral success that Lloyd George had many times, that Tony Blair had many times, that Margaret Thatcher had many times, and Boris Johnson had the biggest Conservative victory since Margaret Thatcher.
Point well made. Although I wonder whether to some extent you're kind of talking yourself out of a job, because it sounds to me like if you get the right sort of politician, you don't really need communication advisors. You just want to let them do their thing.
Well, that's missing the point that the Prime Minister or the CEO of a company or, the Vice Chancellor of a university can't answer every letter and every call and write every article and turn up to give every single speech. Yeah. I mean, the scale of the operation at the heart of 10 Downing Street, for instance, where every policy area is relevant, even some footballer in some sort of small sort of side in a small town somewhere a long way from number 10, is something that potentially the Prime Minister is meant to have a view on, not to mention, global tariffs, war in Gaza, war in Ukraine, what is the definition of a woman or a man, and where do you stand on tricky sort of transgender issues and all that. It's a huge operation. So I don't think there's any danger, even if you had the most professional communicator ever at the heart of number 10, that you don't need people around them who help them tell their story to all the different audiences that are listening.
It seems to me that to simplify things a little bit, there are two kinds of politicians. Ones who are tremendously popular with their own base and at building their own base, but aren't always as good at appealing to people who don't share their basic values. And there are others who somehow seem pretty good at winning over audiences generally. I'm thinking of people like Bill Clinton or perhaps pre-Iraq Tony Blair. And of course, there's a third kind who, probably don't appeal to anybody as well. Could you say something about that difference? Because it does seem to me that is quite an important distinction in the kind of politicians we have in the world at the moment. Those who really are loved, but only by some, and those who are reasonably liked, but by many.
If you're only liked by some and people with your worldview, there's rarely a majority there to win a democratic mandate to operate. So by definition, the only people who win elections in the end, and certainly the only ones who secure majorities are those who do appeal way beyond whatever narrow group that may be their sort of so-called core vote. And so the trick for Margaret Thatcher, if you go back to that, was that she persuaded working class people who traditionally would have voted Labour to vote for her because they got to buy their own council houses and they got to feel proud to be British again and have war in the Falklands and all that. Tony Blair actually made it virtually impossible for the Conservative Party to compete for a decade, because if the leader of the Labour Party is a privately educated Oxford graduate who is a barrister, who's married, who's friendly with a US Republican, who's a big royalist and loves the Queen, and an Anglican who then crossed the floor to become a Roman Catholic. Where do you go if you are trying to be to the right or traditionally more conservative than that? That was the secret then of Boris as well, was that working class people across Britain, the north of England, my native South Wales, massively disillusioned with politics in general, pretty much loathing most of them of the Conservative Party as a brand in itself, nevertheless felt that they had a connection and they understood what this man, Boris, who uniquely they knew by his first name, was offering them. And so the nature of the appeal, if you are successful, is to go beyond your own ranks. And those who fail and have to go and govern in coalitions, or those people who are leaders like Jeremy Corbyn, never win an election, Gordon Brown never won an election. In fact, fun fact that since the Second World War, I think it's only 4 leaders of the Labour Party who have won elections. And they were all white heterosexual men. They were all selectively educated. They all spent at least some of their education at Oxford. I think there's 5 of them, and 4 out of 5 of them were barristers. Clement Attlee was a barrister. Harold Wilson was an economist. Tony Blair was a barrister. Keir Starmer was a barrister who did a master's at Oxford, I think. So, you know, that's a very narrow pool of people who actually won elections. James Callaghan never won an election. Michael Foot certainly never won an election. Jeremy Corbyn never got close to it.
I should say that Keir Starmer did his law degree at Leeds University. A most important part of his career, I understand. So, who are the personality politicians at the moment, do you think?
Well, in the absence of Boris Johnson, the personality that looms largest in UK politics, and I speak there as somebody who is aware of regional government and of national governments in my native Wales and in Scotland, where we've had extraordinary charismatic people in Scotland over the last couple of decades. But at the moment, one man looms large and sort of clouds out virtually everyone else. And for better or worse, it's Nigel Farage. And in the absence of Boris, he totally dominates, I think, in terms of the character and personality. But back to my key argument, if the policies don't go with a character and personality, or if they're, dare I say, off-putting to many of us, then character and personality alone doesn't get you there.
And that's going to be, the next election in that sense is going to be a really interesting test of your thesis in a sense, because one might argue that with Farage, you've got this great personality without policy, and with Starmer, you've got coherent policies, but not much personality, some might say. So, I mean, in that sense, the question that we've been discussing becomes really quite relevant. Let's say...
I would challenge that. I wouldn't give him sort of coherent policies. This is a government that's talked a big game on growth, and then the first budget brought in measures that actively crushed what little delicate growth there was in the UK economy. This is a government that sort of won by default, if you like, by attacking the chaos of latter-day Conservative governments and the suggestion that they're all on the make, and came in and immediately had scandal after scandal about their own behaviour in that department, and lost the chief of staff and since then a director of comms. So I wouldn't be as generous as that.
Yeah.
So yes, you're right that he's lacking personality, though he's stepped up a bit on the world stage recently. But I think that's a massive oversimplification.
Well, I think
what the choice is at the next election.
No, I mean, I think you're right. If there are an election next week, I guess my assumption about coherent policies is that there might be a chance of some sign of coherent policies between now and the next election, because we don't know whether that will happen or not. But I suspect that there's at least a chance. Let's say that a politician comes to you as an expert in these things and asks how they can make their personality sell in the marketplace. And you've spoken, I think, very eloquently about what the characteristics of such a personality are. I guess my final question to you is, are you looking at whether that person inherently has that kind of potential as something natural or quasi-natural? Or are you, as an expert, able to say to them, I think I can cultivate this in you if you're willing to learn?
We all need a little encouragement to cover the bases that don't come naturally to us. And so you can enhance certain things. You can coax people out of being shy, for instance. You can teach them confidence, if you like. But in the end, you can't kid the electorate. So you can't and you shouldn't try to make somebody something they are not. And nothing is more ludicrous than a politician pretending to be something they're not, some sort of nerd who, was the last, this is very old-fashioned, but the last guy to be picked on the schoolyard when, you were sorting out the sort of football or rugby teams, depending on where you were at school. You can't turn that person into somebody, who is really cool and charismatic and all that, but you shouldn't need to either, because integrity is a hugely attractive characteristic. Empathy is an ability to sum up something in an understated way. Works effectively as well. And you can use that effectively, but people who are not prepared to go out there and make their case, and I think, dare I say, the current leader of the official opposition is notorious about not liking to engage with the media. Well, that's a bit like a rugby player who doesn't want to put in tackles. I'm afraid, we all have our own style and personalities, and nobody should change that. But if you're not prepared to go out there and argue your case, and the whole game is the art of persuasion, then you're probably in the wrong job.
Why do you think she doesn't like engaging with the media?
You really have to ask her that. I don't know. But engaging with the media is, fraught. It's difficult. It's terrifying. Most normal people would hate to sort of be put through their paces on Newsnight or the Today programme or a whole array of things that are out there at the moment. But so would most people hate to go in there and tackle the average 6'6" winger these days who runs at you in, covering 100 metres in less than 11 seconds. But I'm not putting myself forward as a rugby player these days. No. And therefore, if that is not something that comes naturally to you, then politics, however attractive it is, as the old saying, showbiz for ugly people, it's not for you. Find something else, or go into politics to be one of those absolutely critical cogs in a massive machine that has to operate really well at so many levels. But if you want to be the frontman in politics, I'm afraid that the willingness and, dare I say, the ability to communicate effectively is absolutely core and fundamental.
That's a great point on which to end. Incidentally, I was that guy who was always the last person to be picked for the football team. I think I've just discovered why I am not Prime Minister, amongst about 200 other reasons. You've explained it well, and thanks very much for answering those questions.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.